Hi everybody and welcome to today's lecture. Today we'll be talking about democracy some more, and specifically about some of the threats to democracy that already came up in last Wednesday's lecture by Professor Hirschbalin. Starting point for the conversation today will be the work of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was an immensely influential economist, and in fact he is still influential to this day. His work even reached the top on the Amazon bestseller list again in 2010, just to give you an idea of how much people are still talking about him. Now, if you've studied economics, then perhaps this name means something to you. If it doesn't, not to worry. We'll talk about him today as if you have no prior understanding whatsoever. To the right, you see a picture of Shoshana Zuboff, and towards the end of today's lecture, we'll also talk about her work. Hayek is best known for the immensely popular book The Road to Serfdom, which came out in 1944. Just last year, Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, came out, and to great acclaim. She offers us an economist's but also sociologist and psychologist perspective on what she calls the new form of capitalism. What we'll be doing today is we'll be offering philosophical perspectives, or that is to say philosophical reflections, but that are informed by this economist/sociologist perspective offered by these two thinkers. Now, just to be clear, Hayek and Zuboff come from very different directions. Where Hayek was a great proponent of capitalism, Zuboff is very critical of it. And yet, some of the threats to democracy they perceive are very similar. And we'll be exploring those similarities in order to get a grasp on how their theories are extremely relevant, especially today. The three main themes of today's lecture are democracy, knowledge, and economics. Interwoven with those themes are the concepts of liberty and power. Throughout today's lecture, you'll get a sense of how all these concepts are connected and how we can apply them, especially to today's crisis around COVID-19. You may recognize this man, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, who, as you perhaps know, has used the corona crisis to grab a lot of power in his country. And the reason he's been in the news a lot is that even though in many countries, of course, governments are taking extreme measures, the extreme measures he is proposing go a little bit further and also have no clear end to them. That is to say, he has been granted great power without a final date. There is no clear sense of when his power will end. We'll come back to him later. We'll also talk about this COVID app. This is just an example of what this app might look like. You've no doubt heard about this. The idea that in the Netherlands we'll be trying out something that has been rolled out in other countries already with varying degrees of success. The idea that we could have an app on our smartphones which would tell us if we've been close to infected people, and that will tell other people that if we are infected ourselves to stay away from us or to self-isolate, etc. Now, as I already mentioned, we'll be using the work of Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, as our framework for today's discussion. Now, serfdom is a somewhat old-fashioned word and essentially means slavery. Slavery or loss of liberty. Liberty is an important word here. It's of course a synonym for freedom, or in fact you can distinguish between liberty and freedom, but for the sake of our discussion we are not going to. A loss of liberty, liberty, a word that you see return in words like libertarianism or neoliberalism. Now, Hayek is seen, as I already mentioned to you, as one of the founding fathers of neoliberalism and libertarianism both. Now, however you might feel about those terms, or in fact endorse the use of those terms at all, a lot of people who are called neoliberalists don't want to be called neoliberalists because they see it as a pejorative term. That is not our concern at the moment. However you might feel about what these terms stand for, it's important to note that they are essentially theories, doctrines that have liberty at their heart. Freedom is more important than anything else, supposedly, in these various doctrines. Now, it's central to the theory that Hayek lays out for us in his work that capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. According to Hayek, you can't really have one without the other, at least not in the time and place that he is writing this. So the road to serfdom is really about how any doctrine other than capitalism or any economic system other than capitalism will necessarily lead to something undemocratic, to slavery of some kind, to dictatorship, totalitarianism, etc. So it's important to note right from the start that what Hayek is writing about here is not simply economics, but also politics. And for him, the two necessarily go together. Capitalism and democracy are part and parcel. For reasons that will become clear, the terms planning and decentralization are especially important to Hayek. We'll explain the meaning of these terms using a cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom. This cartoon version became very popular and was published within a year of the original publication of the full work by General Motors. This, of course, in itself is interesting, that General Motors, a huge company, would sponsor the publication of a work of economics. Make of that what you will. As I already mentioned, we'll be connecting some of the major tenets of Hayek's work to the current corona crisis. So, like I said, this is a cartoon version of a very complex theoretical work, and we'll be looking at a few of the frames in this cartoon. First one you see here. War forces national planning. There's that word that I indicated is very important for Hayek. To permit total mobilization of your country's economy, you gladly surrender many freedoms. You know regimentation was forced by your country's enemies. So again, we're talking here about a literal war. Of course, as you know, the current pandemic is often described in terms of war and battle as well. We are fighting the coronavirus. We have to band together in this battle, etc. Here we're talking about literal war, and in particular World War II. Of course, it being published in 1944 is historically significant because World War II is just about to end as this work comes out. So Hayek was writing it during World War II. So national planning, why national planning? Well, the government, the state, comes up with a plan in order to allocate resources in the way best suited to fight and win the war. You give up freedoms because you know that this is important for the collective. That at least is Hayek's suggestion here, and I think we can all understand this. In times of crisis, we have to band together. You may have to do things you don't like. You may have to give up things that you like because it is demanded of you by the greater good. After the war, Hayek says, many want planning to stay. What's good in war is good in peace, as the radio says. Arguments for a peace production board are heard before the war ends. Wartime planners who want to stay in power encourage the idea. So the people who during the war came into power or increased their powers because of the national planning that was demanded by wartime circumstances want to stay in power. And that's a really important term here and one that worries Hayek. These planners try to sell the plan to everybody, and in an unsuccessful effort to educate people to uniform views, planners establish a giant propaganda machine, which a coming dictator will find handy. And you see where this is going to go. Planning during the war was relatively easy because everybody understood the necessity and everybody wanted things to get better and so banded together, but selling a plan to everybody in peacetime is much more difficult. So propaganda is used, the press is controlled in order for the planners to get their way. The gullible do find agreement, and this is an important word, though perhaps one you haven't encountered before. Gullible means easily persuaded. So meanwhile, growing national confusion leads to protest meetings. The least educated, thrilled and convinced by fiery oratory, form a party. Now, the war causes a lot of insecurity, a lot of uncertainty. The people with the least information, with the least relevant knowledge, are easily persuaded to follow these planners, one in particular or a group of them. And what Hayek is warning against here, and this will be relevant later on, is that the less educated you are, the more likely you are to follow somebody who perhaps doesn't have the best intentions but can make his plan sound really good. People get more and more restless. There's the desire for a strong man who can make the plan work, because plans are all very nice, but if there's no government, if there's no strong party, if there's not a strong person who can implement the plan, then of course it is no good at all. So the strong man is given power. In desperation, planners authorize a new party leader to hammer out a plan and force its obedience. And there's another crucial turn. There, on the one hand, is the desire for strong leadership, because strong leadership will force obedience, and on the other, this desire is fed by that insecurity I already mentioned. People think, okay, we'll just need somebody strong to push things through right now. Later we can dispense with him, or so they think, says Hayek. A negative aim welds party unity. This, Hayek says, is very typical. In order to band people together again, especially once the war is done, you need a scapegoat minority. You need a scapegoat minority to blame for everything that has gone wrong. Obviously, in Germany, this negative aim was anti-Semitism. No one opposes the leader's plan. It would be suicide. There's secret police everywhere, and they have the ability to force obedience, and this is always the number one virtue in a planned state. It is important that everybody obeys. Your thinking is planned. Propaganda is used in order to plan your thinking, and in a dictatorship unintentionally created by the planners, who perhaps initially had good intentions, there's no room for difference of opinion. Posters, radio, press all tell you the same lies. So your thinking is influenced to the point where you lose your autonomy. Your recreation is planned. This, of course, sounds a little eerie right now, when in fact our recreation is planned, right? We have to do it at a distance from each other, only certain places, not other places. Once started, planners can't stop. So there's this fear throughout Hayek's work that once you leave people to plan, once you give an authority to power to plan things, they can't stop, and they will want to control every aspect of life. Finally, your disciplining is planned. If you're fired from your job, it's apt to be by a firing squad. What used to be an error has now become a crime against the state, thus ends the road to serfdom. Now, this obviously is an extremely grim picture, and I'm not at all saying that what is depicted here is, of course, entirely relevant to our current situation or can be mapped on to the coronavirus response. That said, we do want to pick out a few of the things that Hayek says and see how we can use them as a framework to look at our current situation.